Welcome back, everyone, to another sporting blog podcast. I haven't done one in a while, mainly because life got in the way. I've got a very good roster of guests coming up. I think I said that last time, and then stuff really did get in the way. But let's kick on anyway. So the last few podcasts we've done have focused on women's sport, and those have gone really well. Been interesting discussion, but I wanted to bring in something that's sort of hyper relevant to events that are happening kind of as we speak. And one such event is the Rugby World Cup, which is on now, and England have burgled their way into the semi-final somehow. But I just wanted to bring in someone to discuss something particularly relevant in the sport of rugby, which is head injuries and concussion. So first off, I'm joined by Sam Peters, well-known rugby journalist. Sam, how's it going?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Ollie. Really good. Outrageous
Great.
to accuse England of having burgled their way into the semi-final. They thoroughly
Well,
deserve to be there.
I mean, they certainly deserve it because, as everyone keeps reminding me, you can only beat what's in front of you. I would say it's tragic for the sport that probably the two best games of rugby I've seen in the last decade happen to be quarterfinals. But nonetheless, we've seen some amazing stuff. But I think also we saw a couple of interesting situations with regarding collisions. And I think we've also seen some players come back from collisions in the early rounds that have raised a few eyebrows. But before we get into the details, do you want to just give our audience an introduction to yourself and your life in rugby and in sport in general?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ollie. So I was and have been a rugby journalist for best part of 20 years. I played the game growing up. I started playing rugby when I was 4 for Richmond Minis, and I carried on playing all the way through school. Captained my first 15 at school, went on to Edinburgh University where I was club captain and from time to time captain the first 15 up there as well. So pretty committed rugby lover, to say the least. I've dislocated my shoulder too many times that I care to remember, and ended up packing in playing when I was 22 after 3 reconstructions, but went into covering the game professionally. And at the same time, around the late 90s, early 2000s, when I sort of left university and went into journalism, the sport was evolving very, very radically from an amateur game to a professional game. And it was really clear to me really quickly that there was something really dramatic was happening within the sport, to the injury profile, the volume, the frequency of injuries, the severity of injuries, and by extension, the frequency of head injuries, concussions. I was pretty much immediately quite alarmed by this. I didn't expect to see what I was seeing, but also quite surprised at how little coverage it was getting within the sport itself. It seemed that some of my colleagues didn't see the same thing I was seeing, essentially, or certainly didn't report it publicly if they were seeing it. And I kept a pretty close eye on the injury data. And I, as I say, had these concerns about the number of concussions, the frequency of them, and the amount of times that players were routinely just being allowed to carry on playing when what I considered, in my kind of, uneducated, unprofessional, but simplistic way, that what I understood to be a head injury, a concussion, a brain injury, we can talk about the semantics later, but essentially really demonstrable, obvious signs that someone had a concussion. Days, struggling to stand up properly, lack of balance, loss of consciousness being the most obvious one, and still carrying on playing. And I think really once I became a rugby correspondent at the Mail on Sunday around 2012, 13, 14, that sort of period of time, I really felt I had the evidence and the confidence and the platform to start really going at this story. And we did. We went really hard and said, rugby's got a concussion problem. It needs to sort it out. We'd seen what was going on in the NFL around the same time, where there were lots of deceased players being diagnosed post-mortem with degenerative brain diseases, which had previously only been reported in boxers. But it was really obvious that a lot of the science that had, for various reasons, been sort of essentially buried from as far back as the kind of 1920s, which clearly linked repetitive head trauma with worse neurological outcomes later in life. That that had been put to one side for, say, various reasons, but then this new evidence was emerging from the States, and I just didn't feel rugby was anywhere near close enough to, or doing enough to address the issue. And I faced a lot of resistance, which I write about in the book, a lot of mudslinging, a lot of negativity, a lot of whispering campaigns, and a lot of outright over just negativity, saying I was doing the wrong thing and I shouldn't have been reporting this. But I kind of decided to take my own path because I believed that that was the right path, essentially. I was a journalist first and foremost, so I began reporting on concussion, and that was back in 2013. And really, the book is about that, how I came to report on it, what happened when I did, and what have been the sort of subsequent consequences, I guess, and how the game has changed.
Right, thanks for that. So the book is called Concussed, and one thing I noticed, because you kindly sent me the proof copy to read, one thing that actually stood out to me was in the very beginning is the definition of concussion, because let's say anecdotally, especially, I mean, we're similar ages, as a kid, when you heard that someone was concussed, it essentially meant, in schoolboy terms, or school person terms now, sorry, that, someone had had a slightly bigger head knock than normal, and maybe they felt a bit dizzy and needed to sit down for a while. And that, I imagine, for people of our era, has stayed with us, really. If you're concussed, it's just a sort of an extra head knock. But looking at the definitions of concussion that you place at the start of your book, I mean, the Oxford Dictionary of violently shaking an injury caused to the brain sounds really different to a traumatic brain injury resulting in the disturbance of brain function, which is how World Rugby defines it. Where do you think we're at with people understanding what concussion really means, as opposed to the anecdotal, oh, you're concussed or suffered a concussion?
It's a really good question, and also one that's, I say throughout the book, and I am clearly not a medical expert as such, but the definition of concussion is extremely challenging, and that's been part of the problem for sports medics. Really, it hasn't really been defined that clearly, but I think what have been defined clearly have been the symptoms that players or participants experience when they have essentially suffered an injury, a trauma to their brain, which is significant enough to show symptoms. And that's really the only way that a pitch side doctor can kind of measure whether a player is in a position that they should be taken off the field. And it's one thing that was really clear all the way through is that, and this hasn't really changed at any point, is that if players were showing those symptoms, the ones that I've just described, the loss of consciousness, ataxia, vomiting, all those ones, they should always have been removed from the field. That never changed, and that's where I was coming at this from. Was like, we can argue about the actual definitions, but if we're saying these are the symptoms of concussion, and a player should, under no circumstances, remain on the pitch if they're showing them, the thing I was reporting on was that this is just being ignored routinely. Now, there's clearly a greater understanding of things like subconcussive blows, which are essentially the trauma or the rattling around of the brain inside the skull, which isn't enough to cause symptoms, but over a period of time, repeated, is appearing now clearly from the work that's been done in Boston under people like Professor Anne McKee, showing that exposure, that volume of exposure, is problematic and can be problematic later in life. And that's really the piece that rugby needs to be addressing at the moment.
But I mean, are we getting to the point where, whether symptoms are showing or not, whether someone's going to the full vomiting stage, that, all head collisions should be looked at in the same vein? I mean, I know that's pretty difficult in rugby, where there's accidental collisions, there's knees to heads, there's pile-ups at a scrum or whatever, but essentially the player's health being paramount. Is there not a point where someone's going to draw a line and say, right, any head collision, sorry, you've got to come off?
I mean, a head collision is, again, it's a definition, but I've never proposed that every time I've done that to my head now, I don't believe I've got a concussion. that is technically a collision, I suppose. My hand has touched my forehead, but rugby is obviously goes without saying a highly physical sport and always has been. The thing again that changed at the same time that was changing in terms of how concussion was being treated, but the profile of the sport was changing so radically. So there were more collisions on the pitch. The fact that we were talking about collisions rather than contacts changed. It became a collision sport because of the organisation of the defences and because of the greater physicality of the players and the greater understanding of how players should be organised on the field. And the players were getting bigger, physically stronger, more committed. And so that was, and also the laws were being changed by the administrators in order to enable the game to be more fluid, so faster and more ball in play time. So all of those things were factoring into making more and more collisions at higher speeds with greater forces at play. And I argued all the way through that would come with consequences, and I still argue that today. And in fact, a lot of those consequences have been seen in recent times. But no, I definitely wouldn't argue that every single head contact needs to be examined under sort of head injury assessment protocols. I recognise that you need to have symptoms in order to measure whether a player should go on, stay on, or stay off. And I think the background piece is the exposure piece, which is looking at the number and frequency of head injuries that or subconcussive blows that I described earlier, and how often they're experienced in training and places like that.
Yeah, and I think that what's obviously challenging, and this isn't just rugby, but I was actually at the NFL on Sunday at the Tottenham Stadium, and there was a really nasty blow. And actually, the first time in my time watching NFL, I saw someone actually sent off, which is pretty rare, but it was a mid-air head-to-head collision, and the guy had no intention of getting the ball. He was trying to wipe him out. I don't think he meant to literally go head-to-head, but he was trying to wipe him out. And from our position, everyone in the stadium could see it was bad. So, the medics were straight on. The guy was off. The other dude got sent off. It was that was a common sense approach because everyone could see. I guess the hard bit to know is the players tend to insist that they're okay. One team definitely wants them to stay on. The other team doesn't really, care, but probably wants them to go off. And no one, apart from the referee, I suppose, plays this mediation role in terms of common sense. And that's pretty big responsibility to give to someone who's there to observe the rules of the game rather than observe the health and welfare of the player. How have you found over your kind of the last 10 or 15 years, where does someone like World Rugby or the FA, where do they feel the responsibility lies for the decision on field at the time?
You left a key person out on that one, Ollie, and that's the doctor, who should be playing that mediation role.
Well, I agree, but as we've known from incidents with Mourinho and others, the doctors don't always get their own way either, and they only get to go on when they're almost instructed to. They can't just run on the field. I mean, I know in rugby that's a bit better, but okay, so if it's the medic's responsibility, but who runs the show? Who do World Rugby think should be saying, right, that person needs medical attention ASAP, or do they just get on and sort it out themselves?
Yeah, I mean that's one for World Rugby, and they would say routinely, and they have done routinely, and the RFU, that player welfare is their number one responsibility or number one priority. I question that routinely. You just described the Mourinho scenario with the doctor Cortez, was it the female doctor? That was a classic case for me. Obviously shown in Technicolor and highlighted because it was such a high-profile case and the individual involved was such a high-profile individual. But that kind of culture is exactly what I was trying to challenge and would continue to challenge, where doctors were in any way under any sort of pressure from coaches or directors of rugby or managers in football. I highlighted the Andre Villas-Boas case with the Hugo Lloris case many years ago, which some of your viewers might remember, but this happened sort of concurrently with when I was covering it in rugby in sort of late 2013, when I just started writing about concussion in rugby. And that Villas-Boas case came about in football, and suddenly something that no one had been looking at in football, like, oh, it's not just a rugby problem, this is a soccer football problem as well. And that culture where managers and coaches are so dominant and can literally dictate to doctors when a player is fit or not to return to the field, I just found that to be a massive conflict of interest. And I talk a lot in the book about the ethics of being a sports doctor, and the ethics of being paid by an organisation who also pays the players who you're looking after, who are your patients, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Where do doctors sit in this whole piece? And I've been informed a lot, really, by the work of people like David Walsh and Paul Kimmage, looking at the Lance Armstrong case, and obviously the corrupt practice, medical practice that went on in cycling for so long. And I always had this suspicion that there was this risk in rugby that the same sort of thing could happen. And obviously I write about Bloodgate in the book a lot, Dean Richards' Harlequins case and the fake blood capsule, and the Dr. Wendy Chapman cutting a player's mouth, Tom Williams, with a scalpel to try and basically hide a corrupt practice. And that incident alone really was the sort of catalyst for me going, okay, my suspicions about players being allowed to carry on with brain injuries, concussions, and my concern the doctors aren't doing absolutely the right thing all the time and looking after the player as their number one patient, and this idea that player welfare is our number one priority, which World Rugby said all the time in our review. I just didn't believe it, and the evidence in front of me wasn't that was the case. So that was the kind of setup really for how and why I started writing about it.
And what's your experience been like with the players themselves over the years? Obviously, more high-profile cases. You referenced Steve Thompson in the book, in the forward by Sir Clive Woodward.
Mm-hmm.
I know you mentioned Jeff Astle as well, but in football is obviously a very high-profile case.
Mm-hmm.
There are more of these coming out of the woodwork all the time. How is it now talking to the younger players versus, I don't know, retired players for you? Do retired players acknowledge and say, oh, Christ, we shouldn't have been doing quite what we did? Or and are the younger players more aware? How does that play out?
I mean, I left newspaper journalism about 3.5 years ago, so I'm not on that daily beat speaking to young guys, as I used to be, early days professionals. So again, something I look at in the book is how difficult it is for someone who's 20, 21, who's just signed their first contract for a club, who might be on 60, 70, 80,000 a year, but they could have that contract torn up and their whole dream disappears through injury or through the whim of a coach. Very, very difficult for them to speak openly, and the culture of rugby, for all manner of reasons which I examine, is one which doesn't really allow for the maverick or the outspoken person or the whistleblower as such. But many ex-players that I speak to now say, I wish I'd done things differently. Lots of them would still do it again, absolutely, given that informed choice which they didn't have. But they would definitely look to radically reduce the amount of contact training that they did, the way in which they trained, how willing they were to go back onto the field having suffered a brain injury. You talk about players kind of need protecting from themselves, which is absolutely true. And that's why that doctor role is the kind of barrier between, or the kind of the middle lady between coaching staff and player, is such an important role. But yeah, absolutely, lots and lots of players that I've spoken to during this time and since have said, I wish we'd done things differently. There is still a great opportunity for rugby to continue to do things differently. I think it has absolutely gone in the right direction, and is in a much better place than it was in many areas, although there's still a huge amount that needs to be done to kind of reduce the exposures that these guys get on a season by season basis.
Well, and I can tell you, as someone that has an acquired brain injury, once you've had it, and you look back, not in my case, I couldn't have done anything about it, but when you start to think of certain situations, and then you think about how you're going to live your life going forward, things change dramatically, but right down to the basics like staying hydrated more and all of that sort of stuff. And I can only imagine that some of those ex-players look back in horror at some of the things that happened, especially as you say at the turn of amateur to professionalism. And I'm not decrying any of this because some of it's part of the sports culture, but I can only imagine getting a smashing, a knock on the head, coming off, not feeling so great, and then shoving 10 pints down your throat, and then the next day cracking on with something else. And when you think of it in the round, I imagine players, and things have moved on, thankfully. You touched on the NFL there briefly as well, being a kind of not a leading light by any stretch, but maybe shining a light on the whole thing. How do you think they've dealt with it overall compared to? Obviously they're a bigger commercial organization than World Rugby in financial terms, and they don't have quite as big a footprint, but it's not far off. How do you think they've dealt with it, bearing in mind the amount of IP they're trying to protect versus World Rugby that I guess governs over something much broader and less structured?
That's another good question, but I think clearly the numbers, as you rightly said, involved in the NFL case was absolutely massive in terms of commercial case. You're talking about a best part of $1 billion settlement, $765 million back in 2013 to former players who were suffering neurocognitive problems, early onset dementia, depression, suicide, into their 40s and 50s, again, which were supported with evidence from essentially the brains that have been dissected and examined post-mortem. So that evidence was there. It was settled outside of court without the NFL admitting liability, but essentially that case was all about players saying that they had not been given the information that they should have been given and information that the NFL was privy to. I look at this in the book, and clearly, as you rightly said, World Rugby is a different type of organisation to NFL, but the game has been governed for many, many years by an iteration, the International Rugby Board before World Rugby, as it was called, essentially a collective of unions who all had medical teams looking at this, writing research papers, examining what the risks were for the sport. And my strong argument in the book, which I maintain obviously to this day, is that sport as a whole knew a lot more about this than they let on. Rugby definitely knew more about this than they let on. It didn't just come out of the blue in 2013, as many people would have you believe, and suddenly there was this suggestion as a result of the NFL case that multiple head injuries can cause you significant problems over an extended period of time. That's just not true. This had been discussed many, many years earlier. 1950s, a guy called Thorndike, Augustus Thorndike, was writing about this. In 1928, Harrison Martland identified cases of dementia pugilistica in deceased boxers. This is not new science, but the science has been muddied. The story's been suppressed, and the risk has been underplayed, in my view. And as rugby's professionalism curve took off, went upwards, it became more and more acutely important that people understood that risk, to me. And so I was saying this, lots of people, even people within my own newspaper, which I worked at the time, the Mail on Sunday, said this is kind of nanny state stuff, isn't it? Why are you getting involved with this? It's, just let the game, what will be, completely failing to recognise why I was doing it, and which was responding to an increased risk threat. And when the increased risk happens, you need to change, you need to adapt, and you need to respond. And indeed, rugby's always been a sport that's adapted and evolved, especially since it went commercial, professional. And originally, those changes and adaptations to the game were made in order to make it more attractive, to draw in new audiences. And that was where the faster game came about and longer ball in playtime. But my point is that all that has happened is having a physically detrimental effect on the players, and we need to change it accordingly.
In the at the pre-rugby union professional era, a lot was made about how professional rugby league was, and how far ahead it was in terms of things like fitness and so on. Now, rugby league is the original collision game. I mean, I mean that hasn't changed a great deal. I mean, not like rugby union, where I believe truly that the size and stature of the back line has changed so dramatically, that those forced collisions, especially through the centres, is now sort of a really big part of the tactical game. Rugby league's been doing that for years. What was rugby league's stance on head injuries and collisions? I mean, did they have one?
Yes, but it was not being policed properly at all. I mean, I do have sympathy with rugby union from the fact that, in a way, they've gathered the data, and in a way, that data has been the thing that I've been able to identify, or others have been able to identify, and say, look, here you go, there it is. And also because the games had got a lot more profile, rugby union, professional international rugby union has a far greater, higher profile than international rugby league, and certainly more than club rugby league these days. Although it's a game I grew up loving and watching when it was on terrestrial television. Rugby league's way behind, I'd say, union now. I think there was a period of time where they were basically comparable, and that was when there was an influx of rugby league coaches into union, post-professionalism. Again, I talk about this in the book Concussed. And essentially that kind of culture seeped into union, that tolerance where just head injuries is just carry on, it's just a ding, it's a head knock, it's a, having your bell rung, just get on with it. And this narrative kind of emerged to support that. This pseudoscience essentially emerged to support that narrative, which was, it's fine, your brain just switches off and switches back on, and there's, it's unique to every other organ or muscle or piece of your body. Where you damage it quite badly, it suddenly miraculously just fixes itself and is fine. Nothing else in your body does that. I knew that from my experience with my shoulder. Once I very severely dislocated it the first time, it was never the same again, and never will be. But obviously the brain is uniquely precious to a human being, and therefore needed extra protection. I just, once this kind of culture took hold where it was okay just to send players back on the pitch time after time after time, I decided, for better or worse, I was going to start calling it out, and that's really what I've done for the last 12, 13 years.
I think the point you made earlier about how young players don't have either the platform or the risk appetite to bring these things to the fore and to mention them is really super hyper relevant. And I think this is also, I mean, any people that have listened to some of these podcasts in the past will know my stance on steroids and performance enhancing drugs in sport as well, and why their prevalence is so hard to call out for young players, for the same reason you mentioned. If your contract is there, and you don't know if you're going to get another one, and there's something that can help you either achieve your life's goal, or by the way, lose your job completely, then you're going to do it. And when others are doing it around you, you're also going to. And I feel that that's very similar with the case with concussion as well, because as you say, you're living on a knife's edge from contract to contract, especially in rugby union. And in fact, one of my good friends who's an agent for rugby players would attest to that players are only one injury away from losing all of it. And in the NFL, that's super relevant, right? What is it, 4 years or 2.5 years, the average time a player survives in the professional ranks. So sorry, just a bit of a ramble there, because
it's interesting. I agree with you.
I'm a very big fan of US sport, especially baseball, and then NFL and NHL. And the fact that all of those sports have had steroid scandals would suggest that, and there's no way that English football or rugby would be shielded from those same performance enhancing drugs that have worked in every other sport. So I've always thought that there's going to be a watershed moment, and maybe it's Paul Pogba and others who are going to come out and say, look, I'm not the only one. I don't know, but that the health implications of those, and you can go back to players like Lyle Elzado in the NFL who called it out, who died of brain cancer, and loads of others. And I think that your book is almost doing something similar in terms of pointing out something that is one of those the great known thing that no one talks about,
The elephant in the
or
room.
the big elephant in the room. And it's really interesting for me that association football has made some effort to address problems, especially from the Jeff Astle campaign, with regards to kids not heading the ball so much in practice, if at all. I think that's banned now completely. Do you think that rugby union, rugby league, I think, is a separate thing because they're all crazy, but do you think that rugby union at the junior level is taking this sort of thing seriously now? And do you think there's a sort of permeating pathway that over the next 10 or 15 years, maybe things will right themselves in some way?
I definitely think it's being taken more seriously lower down the game. No question about that, Ollie. I think that happened fairly quickly. I think, in fact, after the Mail on Sunday started running the campaign in 2013. We essentially did the job that the RFU told us they wanted to do, which was to really raise awareness around head injuries. But my suspicion was that they were paying lip service to that awareness campaign, weren't really committing to it, and were actually very concerned about the risk to participation that it was going to cause them. I think now, and I said this and I say this routinely, we had a really well attended launch event down near where I live in Wiltshire 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. And I was saying this to, if you're a parent choosing what sport to play now, most of the time, although absolutely not all the time, you will be able to go to rugby clubs and actually be able to trust that they do understand concussion far more than almost every other sport, and it is hyper sensitive to it, and that's absolutely right. And I've spoken to headmistresses of very big public schools, state-run schools, and all schools that play this sport, and it's absolutely at the top of the agenda for them. I think there's going to be significant changes to the sport still. I don't think what we see on television, the international professional game is something that most parents think is something they'd want their kids to go and play. That's the truth.
I can tell you, I watched the South Africa France game with my wife, and we've got one son who's not so sporty, and the other one's very small, but he's showing all the signs of being athletically gifted. And she was like, "There is no way I'm letting him play rugby," and it's such a shame because they do rugby tots locally, and maybe things will change in 15 years. But I think the optics aren't great in rugby union at the moment because 18, 19 stone centers that can run the 100 in 11 seconds, literally going head to head with each other. It just, the look it's more brutal than it's ever been.
Yeah, and that's watching it on television. Believe me, when you're pitch side, it's significantly more alarming, I'd say, frankly. And I think that is a major problem for the sport, because the sport I used to play, amateur level, I would still hugely encourage people to play, even having done to my shoulder what I did to my shoulder and how much that's affected the rest of my life. I absolutely loved playing rugby in the mid 1990s, early 90s. And I saw a sport which was dangerous. Yes, it's always been dangerous, always will be, but the risk profile was tolerable to me. I accepted the level of risk that there was. I also write about in the book, many cases of severe spinal injuries and other head brain related injuries, which were always reported as freak accidents. And my work that I've done, I guess, over the last 20 years has suggested to me, as someone who always believed that the risk profile was tolerable, that actually I didn't understand it fully, and that the full picture wasn't being presented. And that's sort of gone on, to use your performance enhancing drugs reference, but that's kind of gone on to steroids in the last 20 years. That risk profile, the curve has gone up. It was denied for a long time. lots of people within the governing bodies were saying nothing's changed here. In fact, at certain points in sort of around 2010-11, there was senior medical people in rugby saying not only is nothing changed, the sport's safer than it's ever been, which to me was just completely and utterly ridiculous. It was defying common sense. It was defying everything. And yeah, it's majorly problematic that the sport that everyone sees on television is not a sport that many parents would actually be comfortable with their kids playing. And that was always my argument. You know, this is getting beyond where it was ever meant to be. The sport was not designed to be this physical. It wasn't designed to be this dangerous, essentially.
Well, and I think that's a problem for NFL. I mean, not NFL. That's obviously the pinnacle of the sport, but for many parents in the United States as well, kids playing high school football, it's not lawless by any stretch, but the stakes for some of the kids in order to get into college on free rides, the stakes are so high, and the competitive nature of it is so extreme that I think the game's gone to a place that no one really ever expected it to go in terms of the athletic ability. There's not just one unique athlete on the pitch anymore. There's dozens of them, and then you whittle it down to the next level at college, where only 2% of high school players make it to college, and then 0.1% of those college players make it to the NFL. I mean, and now you're talking about 300, 400-pound monsters that are doing anything to keep their contracts again. And I think it's the same in rugby. The way the sport looks. I mean, the two games we saw over the weekend, the sheer level of stamina was like nothing I've ever seen. I mean, basically 80 minutes non-stop, and to carry that amount of weight and to run at that intensity, it's really unrecognizable from even 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the sport changed very, very radically from sort of 95 to, say, when England won the World Cup in 2003. But you're quite right to say, Ollie, you know, it continues to evolve very quickly. Watch the 2003 World Cup now, and the size of the guys is dramatically different to today. You know, so that upward curve in terms of bigger, stronger, faster just carries on. That arms race that just carries on, and I really do believe that is detrimental to the game. I think we have to have a grown-up conversation about weight limits, about radically reducing the amount of contact training. I write in the book, I highlight and identify figures that are, you know, owned by World Rugby and RFU, by the way. They're not contested figures, but which show that injury rates in training are way, way higher today than they were at the start of professionalism. Now, part of that is unquestionably down to better identifying injuries better. 100% agree that, or accept that is part of the problem, but I 100% disagree that it's the whole problem. The injuries in training are totally unacceptable. They're unnecessary. They're detrimental to performance on the weekend. They demonstrate that player welfare is not the number one priority. Eddie Jones being appointed England coach, you can actually look at the data essentially and go, oh, that's when he took over, because suddenly these appalling injuries started happening in training at within the England setup. You've set up the game in England where the club coaches and strength and conditioning staff are essentially kind of competing with the England strength and conditioning staff. The players are the pawns in the middle. Horrible position, and absolutely not putting player welfare at the top of the priority list. So yeah, that's there's lots more to be done. Lots more big conversations that rugby needs to have. Whether it can do it fast enough remains to be seen.
Yeah, agreed. I don't want to keep you too much longer. Let's just move to slightly cheerier notes. I presume you're looking forward to the two semi-finals. New Zealand are heavy favourites, obviously, to walk over Argentina, and South Africa are strong favourites to beat England. Let's assume the bookies are right. How would you see a South Africa All Blacks final going?
that I would still just about edge South Africa. I think their lack of goal kicker could still catch them. Be very difficult to win a World Cup without a sort of 85% goal kicker. But and New Zealand, it's kind of been perfect for them because no one was fancying them early on, and even the worst New Zealand teams are still highly competitive, as we saw with that deserved win over Ireland, I thought. But real massive shame that Ireland and France aren't in the semi-finals. They're clearly two of the best teams, two of the best four teams in the world. But England are there, and good luck to them. Well done. You've done it. They've done exactly what they've been asked to do, which is beat what's been put in front of them. But I can't see them beating South Africa. But then I covered the tournament in 2007 when they lost 36-0 to South Africa in the pool game. It was the worst England performance I'd ever seen until I watched them play France at Twickenham in the Six Nations this year. But I can't see England beating South Africa in the semi, and can't see Argentina beating New Zealand in the semi either, although they have obviously done that in recent times. So South Africa just favourites for me overall, but New Zealand right in the mix as well.
Yeah, and both teams, I think, have the unbelievable ability to bring people off the bench as well, who are like for like replacements. It's amazing to see that South Africa's captain go off on 50 minutes and basically play a cheerleader part for the second half and still come out with that intensity. Okay, Sam, look, it's great to speak to you. The book is Concussed. Let people know where they can get it. Where can they find the book?
Thanks, Ollie. You can visit the Concussed website, concussed.media. Concussed-media. And in fact, you could come and see us. We've got I'm going to be appearing at Toppings in Bath, a great bookshop in Bath, on November the 2nd, along with Steve Thompson and Lewis Moody. We're going to be on a panel discussion there. And then November the 23rd, hot off the press, we're going to be at the Story Club in Paddington. Got a fantastic evening there. Tickets are going to be available via our website as well. Or just go to your local bookshop and buy a copy. But we've got more events to come. And if you visit the Concussed Media website, all our events and speaker engagements are going to be on there. And it'd be great to have some of your listeners and viewers come along and listen to what we're saying.
Great. Well, we'll link to the website and your socials in the show notes, and we'll put something out on our social as well. So, Sam, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to talk, and maybe we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate you having me on, Ollie. Thanks very much.